This interview is happening because of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's year, her turn, which was supposed to be a year in which the National Trust focuses on the histories of women relative to their cultural landscape, the one owned by the National Trust. And of course, because this is the year of the COVID pandemic, which was sort of, it's been a surprise to us. We decided to hold a series of interviews online about the subject of the Farnsworth House to sort of dig into that history until the house can actually open so that people can experience the inhabited experience of living in Dr. Farnsworth's house, viewing Dr. Farnsworth's house as she lived in it between the years of 1951 and 54. So until that's possible, there will be a series of interviews online in which different experts and historians are interviewed around the subjects of making architectural history, writing architectural history, and in this case, specifically what it means to write a feminist architectural history. So I want to thank Dr. Alice Friedman for participating in this interview. It's really an honor to get to talk to you about your research. As somebody who teaches architectural history, theory, and studio, your work was really inspiring to me in graduate school and helped sort of form my perspectives on certainly ways in which one could write architectural history from an interdisciplinary perspective. So I think just to begin the conversation, I would love to know what inspired the work I know best, at least, Women in the Making of the Modern House, which was actually written and published in 1998. So 20 years earlier.
That's a long time ago, yeah.
But I would say, groundbreaking, because it's just this year that the National Trust has decided to focus on women's stories. And you were doing this, 2 decades before it's now become institutionally fashionable. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak to what inspired your decision to do that research at a time when it wasn't as fashionable.
I'm happy to do that. Let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to have this conversation and to get to know your work a little bit. And also, I want to compliment you on the carrying the torch forward on feminist studies of this house, but also in general. It's so important to see the work of women and feminist scholars related to these, particularly these major projects. So I got involved. I was finishing my PhD in the late 70s, and very interested, along with other scholars who were slightly ahead of me, people like Gwendolyn Wright or Dolores Hayden. So there was beginning to be a very rich conversation about how to do feminist architectural history and what parts history, what parts architecture, and how to combine those two in an interdisciplinary analytical practice. Since I had been quite interested in the interdisciplinary study of architectural history and also had learned from being an art historian and also learned from talking to architects to be more careful about looking at the physical environment. When I began, I thought for sure, because they were such important projects like the Farnsworth House or the Schroeder House by Gerrit Rietveld or Le Corbusier's Stein de Monzy, that I had thought that all the work would have been done on the clients, and I could just use that data, in a sense, to explore my hypothesis. And then it turned out that none of the work had been done about the clients, and nobody really cared that much about the clients. Surprise, surprise. Farnsworth, for example's papers were in her nephew's garage in the box. And so I had to do, I was trained as a historian, so it wasn't the end of the world, but I had to do the work myself.
Could you talk
So
about
it ended up taking a little bit longer than I thought.
But I think that's the part to me that's really fascinating, is that you chose these houses, the Farnsworth House, the Barnsdall House, all of these houses that are really well known canonically, but you were sort of researching the other side of that as well. So the inhabitant side. Could you talk about what that meant? I love your description of going to Fairbank Carpenter's garage and digging for Dr. Farnsworth's memoirs. Could you talk a little bit about that process of reconstructing?
Well, it's actually even more peculiar because there was no email. So I had gotten a phone number for Fairbank Carpenter and from somebody. And I called up and he said, oh yes, I have my aunt's papers. They're in the garage. And I said, can I come and look at them? And he said, well, I have to go to work during the day. So why don't I just give them to the Newberry?
Oh my
and then you can work on them there. And so that's how that came about.
What year was that? That must have been,
95 maybe. The book came out in 98, so maybe 94, 95.
and she had passed away in 1978. So that meant for that almost 20 years they'd been in
Yeah, let's say 15 anyway. As often happens with people's papers, I'm glad he didn't throw them out. But they recognized her role, I think, and her importance for architecture. And I don't know exactly what happened, because when I looked at them, they were pretty much uncatalogued. And it seems very clear from your work that you've been able to find much more in those papers than I ever found.
Yeah, it's incredible. And actually it's, they've done a great job cataloging it, and they've sort of established, I think it's 3 full boxes and then an entire box of photographs. They've done a great job, but it's amazing to know. I had no idea that's the way they found their way to the Newberry. I didn't realize that you were actually...
Oh, it was very exciting. And, in that book, Women in the Making of the Modern House, I had to cobble together quite a lot of different strategies, methodologies for working. So in that case, I was lucky. The thing that I could do the best, which is archival research, I was able to do. And of course, the Newberry had so many wonderful things for me to explore around and related to the topic. The Johnson New Canaan project, when I started, Philip Johnson was still very much alive. Now it's much easier in a sense. It's always easier to deal with people who are no longer living than alive people.
Yeah.
Living subjects are more difficult to handle.
Well, it's true. I mean, I think it's certainly been true for Dr. Farnsworth, right? Like, she's been spoken for. I think the speaking for her started beginning maybe in 1985, when the narrative of her supposed love affair with Mies van der Rohe became the sort of narrative of the entire house. I wonder if you could speak to you were maybe the first scholar to sort of problematize that love story as not the story about the house. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because it's been for whatever reason, it's been the sort of primary narrative of the history of the structure, and I think in ways really eclipsing her actual biography, her, extraordinary accomplishments as a physician and researcher, as a poet, and as a translator of poetry.
Yeah, I think what's interesting in that same feminist methodology that many people were working on in the 70s and 80s and 90s helped me enormously. For example, the ways in which feminist readers of literature learned and wrote about, and therefore taught me to read against the grain a little bit when you confront a narrative. Not only looking at the voice of the speaker, but what's said and what's left out, and the genre of writing. Someone once said to me, well, of course Farnsworth was so angry. She was speaking the language, in your sources, she's speaking the language of litigation. She's speaking the language of the courtroom. and building a case. And it's actually more, and we know it was much more complex than that. So I think that's something that I have been trying to learn ever since then as well, is how to interpret the silence of the archive, how to listen more carefully to what's said and what's not said, and also to explore in the archive the way, the whole strategy of representation in the archive, right? What literary scholars and students of language and art history, for example, also talks about in terms of the strategies of representation, where there are conventions of speaking, how those conventions fit into established narrative structures, for example. And the love affair of Edith and Mies is, like, it seems to me, a straight up narrative structure of a Hollywood romance gone, with a spurned woman heroine, or a spurned woman as the lead actress.
Yeah, which of course makes it very easy to dismiss, some real concerns about the cost of the house, real concerns about the sort of function or dysfunction early on of the house.
Well, and I think also, Nora, that's really interesting to me is looking at letters and diaries that record breakups of relationships and infidelities and disappointments between lovers. There are certain strategies and certain things that people say, and it always struck me as very revealing that Edith Farnsworth never said any of those same things. I thought you loved me would be one thing that people would say, and how dare you leave me? Why would you leave me? Or we had planned on this amazing future, or I had such high hopes. I mean, there are all these cliches of things people say in a divorce or when they break up. And she never said any of those things. Whereas sometimes I think if friendships stop or they run into problems, people often express their disappointment in silence or in resentment about, that has nothing to do with the kind of cliche of, oh, she thought that the architect went with the house.
Yeah.
That's just stupid.
I think it's definitely uninformed. Yeah, I do. And I think it's
very, when I say it's stupid, it's so unimaginative to assume not just that what we would call that narrative structure, but to assume that that's the story, as if that were the only kind of relationship that two people, regardless of their gender and sexual orientation, that those were the only kind of relationships people ever had.
Absolutely. Or I think there's a more recent biography of Mies in which I think the sentence is, Mies and, Dr. Farnsworth and Mies worked together closely as if to suggest a romance, ? And I thought, well, that's certainly, and I think that was published in like 2012. And I thought, that is a really limited understanding of why and how women and men might work together, especially on something in which you've hired somebody to design your house. But I do
and also, it's just to make one more point, it's like, it also doesn't really take into account something that we do know and can talk about readily, and that is the complexities of relationships between architects and clients, regardless of gender. In the case in point, for which there's much documentation, we're very fortunate, is out of the Frank Lloyd Wright archives. You can see that Wright had these extraordinarily dramatic and emotional relationships with men and women that had zero to do with sexuality and everything to do with love of a certain kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's much more interesting.
Oh, much more interesting. Yeah, but I do.
Yeah.
I mean, what I love that you're addressing is the fact that there's so much subjectivity in the authorship of history, perhaps
In history, sorry.
in writing history. I mean, that's what I keep kind of encountering, at least in studying Dr. Farnsworth, is, you know, from Franz Scholz, who spends an entire paragraph giving his description of Dr. Farnsworth's body as unattractive. You know, like subjectively, I guess that was a decision he made because he wanted to build a sort of understanding of her as somebody who Mies could not be attracted to and therefore was not, except, you know, in the case of maybe having a relationship to make the house happen, I think is the way that Scholz sort of spins it in his biography of Mies. But it seems like there's so much subjectively about Dr. Farnsworth's intimate life, about her body, to the extent that she almost physically becomes another artifact in this construction of history. Yeah, I find it to me, I mean, it's both disturbing, of course, but also kind of remarkable that that is the extent to which there's a sort of subjective interpretation of her life. And I wonder if maybe you could speak to that. I mean, I know that's something that you've addressed in a beautiful essay you wrote years ago that I love. In this.
You broke.
Oh, no. Okay. Okay.
So you might have to back up and say that again.
Okay. Well, I think the topic of subjectivity in the authorship of history, especially architectural history, where, as you said, there are these complicated relationships, right? And so as historians and writers, there is a bit of reading into what's happening. And you've written about that as an historian. There's a beautiful essay you wrote titled "In This Cold Barn We Dream." And I've always loved an excerpt from it in which you describe that as researchers, we must project our imaginations into the spaces we cannot go to, especially if they're distant historically or physically distant from us. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that having to interpret and what that means, especially for you around the question of Dr. Farnsworth and omissions from her archive that you've discovered.
Well, thank you very much for mentioning that article. It's also very long time ago that it came out. I think it's from the 90s.
I think so.
And, you know, during that whole period that I was working on that book, and right up to the present, I really do feel very strongly. I used to say that I wished that I could do architecture via the seance method.
Yeah.
And that we could, architectural history, sorry. That it would be so wonderful, except that you realize it wouldn't be wonderful because the subjects like Edith Farnsworth would say whatever they wanted to say, or Mies, or you know, any of the people that I've interviewed or worked on say what they want to say. And of course we have to, as historians, step back and try really hard to read against the grain, or listen, and also listen against the grain. And interestingly enough, when you mentioned that article, when we first started communicating about this topic, it was really great for me because in the last year, I've become a super fan of a historian called Saidiya Hartman. And Saidiya Hartman wrote an article called Venus in Two Acts in 2005, and then most recently a beautiful book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And in the article, she coins a term, and I have to say I read the book first, and because it relates to my current project, which is about urban culture in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. She goes up as far as that. But so I read the book first, and then I got really interested in her methodology. And I thought I had discovered her. And of course, this year she was named a MacArthur Fellow.
Oh, well, but still.
So I thought I was so smart. I had discovered Zadia Hartman. She teaches at Columbia. I did not discover her. But when her work came into my life, I was so interested because she coined this term called critical fabulation. In which, and so for 15 years and longer, she's been exploring the silences of the archive and the need to, because in her case, looking at the history of slavery and enslaved peoples, the silences and the scraps of evidence that she's had to work with or she's worked with, there's an interview online on the MacArthur site that I saw that I want to just share with you really quickly a quote from it. And I'm going to massacre it because I tried to write down what she had said. At the very end of the interview, she said that she does the research of a scholar, but that she wants the work to read with the beauty of a novel. Because, and her work does read that way, because she recognized that either there would be nothing or very little or two words about the people that she wanted to see as real people, or the archive would only produce the documentation of arrest, imprisonment, legal jeopardy, the official narrative about people's lives would be all about all the trouble they were in. So we're very lucky to have Farnsworth's memoir, albeit written in the voice of a memoir, because otherwise we would just have, the word of some of the boys in Misa's office or the documentation related to litigation.
Yeah.
But in Wayward Lives, Zadia Hartman says that for these young Black women that she was writing about, who she sees as pioneers in making a modern way of living in the city, as rebels and as alternative thinkers and alternative experiences, that she longed to get away from all of the archival documentation of being in trouble, and to see any kind of photograph instead of a mugshot or whatever, a photograph of an interior with a little house plant on a windowsill. Something about the texture of real life, the texture of emotional complexity. And I think I became a super fan, having been very concerned with this sort of imaginative reconstruction or critical fabulation, being concerned with how do we tell the stories of people like Edith Farnsworth from the documentation we have, but what's the material culture, as Adrienne Rich's poem suggests, what's the material culture for her story? And I think it's because of that I was so excited to find those photographs at the Newberry of the house, which we knew or know often from such pristine, beautiful Shelter magazine shots. I was so excited to see those pictures of the little food dogs on the steps, because suddenly they opened up a world that had not of real person making real choices that hadn't been documented.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that for me, it's been a question about this year, right? Of restaging the house, re-inhabiting it with her furniture.
Oh, yeah.
Reproductions of her furniture from the period before a flood sweeps in 1954. And on the one hand, yes, the first time we've seen it as it was actually lived in, because, typically it's
so great.
It's gorgeous. And at the same time, it's still I don't know, like a fabrication, or she's still elusive, I think. Her identity, her persona, her presence cannot be summarized by objects, right? So there's still, to me, this elusivity of actually bringing the person who lived there back into the space. And I don't know that there's actually an answer for that.
Very hard.
Yeah, it is very hard. I think you would have to have a seance.
It's very hard. I think, you know, I was so struck when I was working on Stein de Monzy, the Corbusier house, the Villa Stein de Monzy. I was so struck by a photograph of the house, again, not in the way Corb had intended it, but with all of their Italian heavy wooden Renaissance and Renaissance revival furniture. And it was, you know, it was, to me, such a great moment to think about inhabitation. Also, for that house, I wish we had this for Farnsworth. It'd be so great. There are home movies.
Oh, I wish.
If we had home movies of the Farnsworth house, what would we be able to find out about the texture of their lives, of her life?
Yeah, it's true. The only thing, I think one of the docents did a great job taking oral histories with her neighbors, and they have great descriptions of her, you know, having vermouth in the afternoons. She really loved vermouth. She smoked all the time. She would like have all the children who lived nearby in the summer, she would have them over, and she would, you know, she enjoyed spending time with them. And I have a few really great photographs of her. There's like a little girl eating like a sandwich at this beautiful Franco Albini table in the front room. And so there are just a few images that seem to exist that belong to other people of how she lived in the house. And you're right. I mean, to see that materiality, the sort of non-preciousness of it, the sort of messiness is really...
well, and those things give us access. It's like Saidia Hartman's little houseplant on the windowsill. And how do we make up, particularly, you know, for people who are not often the subject of history, how, and I think Farnsworth is this in one kind of category. I think the women that Saidia Hartman is writing about are often, you know, sort of neglected, or, you know, the women and men that she's writing about who were enslaved. And there, you know, I think it takes all we've got of imagination and diligence to do, you know, the research of scholars, but have the imagination and the ability to make beautiful, to make those people come alive again through beautiful writing. And, you know, I think it's obviously hard work to do it. But, you know, I think the more people who, that's why I'm so impressed by what you're doing. The more people who are confronted, I can't tell you how many people have said to me, even more recently, but certainly when the book first came out, gee, I never knew anything about the client. I never knew, you know, that it was a woman. And then they would say, well, Miss Farnsworth or Mrs. Farnsworth. And I'd be, you know, actually she was quite a prominent nephrologist. And I think the other thing is, because this is still a recurrent theme of criticism of the kind of work we do, that it's just the backstory, right? That it's just, there are people who are like, well, it's not really relevant to the house to know about Edith. It's not really relevant to the house to talk about her private life or her intimate moments. And, you know, I've many times in the course of my career, people have said, well, really what you write about is gossip.
Oh my God.
And that's not relevant, you know, that the story begins and ends with the house or the building. And I think it's really two things, I think. One is that, can't be the case because we're so interested in dwelling and in habitation and the texture of lives. But also, I've learned not to go too far in the other direction, and I really had to learn it from my colleagues in the architecture world, to be very as attentive as possible to the building. And to the design and to the materiality of architecture, and to pay it its due. I mean, nothing surprised me more, given, that I had sort of been the champion of Edith's story, and her modesty and her anger and all these things, to get to the Farnsworth house and, basically fall head over heels in love with the beauty of the architecture, but also the beauty of the experience that it conveys. And I think that Edith felt that too.